Horror Academic, and this month we're going to be looking at another horror classic. I was thinking maybe for Valentine's Day we should check out something on the romantic side. So, my pick for this month is Candyman. Now, Candyman's origins are from a Clive Barker story, actually from this Book of Blood edition. I believe it was volume 5 in the UK. Over here it came to us in the Flesh. The short story is called The Forbidden, and it is essentially what we end up seeing in the film, except in a different time and place. So, Barker's story is really a stab at class differences in Liverpool, England. We're in the late 80s. He's talking a lot about the poor versus kind of the bourgeois, this kind of academic ivory tower world that perhaps doesn't notice what's going on for the rest of the city. So really it's a look at, very much like in the film, the character of Helen, who is a research, I believe, PhD candidate doing her thesis, and she is exploring, but in this case she's extremely interested in the graffiti end, and that's where she starts seeing Candyman, Sweets for the Sweet, all the things we see in the film. It isn't till the film version, which comes to America, that we see it take on kind of the racial inequalities that we see and we kind of associate with Candyman. It does not come from the original story. It's, like I said, it's more class-based. It's the middle class versus their kind of this disillusionment of what's happening with the poor. This kind of attitude where that's them, it doesn't affect us. So, The Forbidden's published in '86 over in the UK, and by the time everything comes to America to make the film, now it's 1992 when we decide to start working on the theatrical version. Interestingly enough, even though it's set in America, in the inner city of Chicago, it's made by a British man. So he's still someone who is very affected by what Barker is trying to say in the original short story, but he brings it to America and decides to kind of make it very American in that way. So here we are in Chicago. Caprese Green at the time, in the early 90s, had kind of the reputation as being one of the most dangerous, at least in the Midwest, of all the projects. So it's not only just set in the world of Caprese Green, but it's actually filmed there. The writer and director of the film is Bernard Rose. So here's someone who spoke to Clive and said, I'm really interested in taking the story of The Forbidden and doing something with it, and, Clive pretty much gives him his blessing and says, well then, go for it. And Candyman is being made. He's absent, and he's fine with it. He's got enough going on, he's licensed it at this point. He's happy with what he sees from what Rose has suggested for the story, and pretty much says that he trusts him to move forward. So the other thing that the original short story is really short. It's not even a novella. It's a short story. So there's no backstory on the Candyman. So it isn't until we get to the film that we have to try to figure out who the Candyman really is. He's just kind of this boogeyman phantom in the first story. So by the film, now it's really important to really flesh this out, no pun intended, to make him more sinister or more tragic, one way or the other. We have to decide what kind of villain is he. So it isn't till we start seeing the casting, and Virginia Madsen is cast in the role of Helen, and Tony Todd is given the task of being the Candyman. And the story that I've read is that it's in the rehearsal process, in getting to know their characters better, that Tony Todd really starts to help flesh out who the Candyman really is, where he comes from, what his story is, what is his legend. It's kind of vague, I think, before that. So we end up with this idea of the son of a slave who is an artist, who has great skill and is known throughout the area, and a rich white man, hires him to make the portrait of his daughter, and of course the two of them fall in love, and that's a tragic end right there. For the Candyman, it's sealed, and he is brutally attacked and murdered by this angry mob who not only chop off his hand because it was, as an artist, that was his tool, so they wanted to take that away from him, but they also, because they're at close to a hive, they cover him in honey and the bees pretty much devour his flesh. So that's where we get kind of these elements kind of coming together more. So yes, he's had a hook on his hand since the short story. Yes, he's had bees surrounding him since the short story and encased within his chest cavity. So now we understand why. So that's pretty cool that they were able to enhance the story once it came to the big screen. And we know that that's not usually the case, right? When you go from a story, particularly a short story, to a film, usually they drop things as opposed to, really enhancing it and adding to it, which is really cool that they were able to do that. So, put on top of that some beautiful cinematography and, some amazing score music by Philip Glass, who's pretty legendary at that point. It really has this heightened feel throughout the film. It's dark and disturbing and beautiful at the same time, right? So it's one of those films where it's kind of has you entranced. The Candyman himself, of course, has the power of thrall, which is very much like a vampire would have, right? So he's able to kind of entice and lure and kind of bring in under his own power his victims. So all of these things work together. Beautiful film, amazing film. So, I mean, if you're like me and you are definitely a fan of the original, I do recommend, if you haven't already seen it, to check out the sequel, Farewell to the Flesh. It's moves the whole story out of Chicago, puts it in New Orleans. Not really sure why they did that, except for some aesthetics that they wanted to include Mardi Gras. But it definitely, it's a suitable sequel, right? Where, Candyman does say a lot because of this whole reimagining in an American setting and an American backdrop of 1992. I mean, you definitely have a lot of social commentary about kind of like how Barker's story talked about the differences in class. This is talking about class and race and the intersection and how, we're still very separate worlds. And I think the Candyman does that very well. Unfortunately, for as much as I think Farewell to the Flesh is a great follow-up to the film, it doesn't have too much of that. I mean, it's in New Orleans, so you can still see this racial divide within the community, but I don't see it very much addressed within the context of the film like I did in the original. So overall, it's a great sequel. Again, it's beautiful. It uses Philip Glass music again, so you have that score element. Cinematography's great. Tony Todd's amazing. It's really well put together, well acted, good sequel. I will just throw in there really quick. I did go on, I think it was on Amazon Prime, had free for the month part 3, so I did check it out. I'd stayed away from it for years. It's just, all I ever heard was bad things. First off, it's called Day of the Dead, and you all know how I feel about anything being called Day of the Dead that's not George Romero's Day of the Dead. But on top of that, yeah, it was pretty crap. Stay away. You're not missing anything. It's really like a product of its time, which is 1999, which is not a time that we really want to remember in horror. There's not a lot amazing things that come from it. This is one of those straight-to-video style slashers that was very much in that kind of vein at the time. Post, I Know What You Did Last Summer and Scream, all those kind of movies that tried to emulate that over and over and over. It got lumped in there, and it's just kind of like a cheesy, pale silhouette of what we see in these originals. So 1 and 2 are good. Down for 3. But let me talk a little bit. I don't have a massive collection for Candyman. Like you say, you saw, you should have In the Flesh that you can read The Forbidden. I don't have the Laserdisc of Candyman, unfortunately. The only version I've ever seen is kind of a movie only, kind of like equivalent of what was on VHS at the time, with of course better audio. Was never able to pick one up, and since it wasn't a special edition, I didn't really go out of my way. I would probably like to eventually add it to my collection and get Tony Todd to sign, but at this point I don't have it to show you guys. Maybe one day I will, and I'll throw a picture in the comments when I get it. But the DVD. So This is the TriStar, Columbia TriStar edition of the DVD. This version came out in '98, so it's pretty, pretty recent after the release. As far as extras, this is back in the day when they list interactive menus as an extra. Yeah, so not too much going on there. Widescreen format, theatrical trailer, pretty standard fare. Um, it's worth having to have a classic. Not worth for much else. So you will understand why I was so excited to find out that, we all know how I feel about Shout Factory, Scream Factory editions. The special deluxe collector's edition of Candyman came out, and I believe I pre-ordered this one. I was so excited. This one came out in 2018, so I got this one right away when it came out, because I love this film so much. It has both the theatrical and the uncut versions of the film. I'm assuming I hadn't seen these elements within the film before. Some of it was familiar, but probably from seeing it in documentaries and photo stills from Fangoria at the time. It's essentially almost the same running time. What's really great about this, as usual on these Scream Factories, is some of these great behind-the-scenes documentaries, and more importantly, the retrospective style of documentary that they're doing for these editions is awesome. This is a film that really it really was long awaited to see so much painstaking work being done to remember this classic. We have restorations, 4K scans. So there's several commentary tracks, some that are labeled as new, with Tony Todd, the director, Clive Barker, Virginia Madsen, the producer, Cassie Lemons, who played Bernadette, is on here as well. The kind of mini shorts here, which are on, I believe they're on a different Blu-ray edition, which is Sweet's the Sweet, which is about the Candyman mythos, and Clive Barker Raising Hell, which is a little mini interview with Clive, which is always cool to see. Storyboards, theatrical trailers, TV spots, still gallery. Great. Unrated cut. Again, we got new scans. The interview on here with Tony Todd, that's labeled as the new one, the Be My Victim piece. It's great to hear him talking now about how he feels about the film, which is excellent. Also, there's a great interview with Virginia Madsen. It's called It Was Always You, Helen, which is wonderful to hear her looking back as well. We don't hear from her as much in the horror community, so that was really excellent. There's pieces on the makeup work, the production design, all these great features. There's a piece talking about the original short story by Douglas E. Winter, who has written about Barker in the past. So probably the most important piece of new documentary work on the Blu-ray special edition for Candyman is a really great conversation between two professors, two film writers, talking about looking at Candyman now. And the two people who are in the conversation are professor and writers Tananarive Due and Stephen Barnes. Tananarive Due, she was the executive producer on the documentary Horror Noir, which came out last year, which was like the best documentary of the year. And it's available on Shudder, and it is a look from the Black audience looking at African American representation in horror cinema over the years. And the people they have talking are the people who are in the movies and how watching these movies affect and vice versa. And it's a really excellent look, and so she was very instrumental in making that happen. She's also an author, she's an educator. Her husband, Stephen Barnes, he's also an educator and a writer, and together they've collaborated on works and classes that look at Black representation in horror, much like Horror Noir does. So, all of this to say, it's an extremely important piece that puts Candyman in perspective and talks about how it works today and how some things that don't work today that you wouldn't do today if you were to make this film. A good portion of the question is that it's, a white man making this film, how does that change the way that Black representation is shown? Not to mention the time period that we're dealing with. Most of the cast is Black in this picture, in a time when that wasn't particularly normal in mainstream horror. I mean, in a few years after that, we'll see films that are kind of centered around a black audience, where because of Helen being the center of the story, she's an alien in this world where she doesn't belong, right? Because she's crossed all these boundaries of race and class to be in the world where, the Candyman resides. So it's interesting to me, especially because these are things I hadn't particularly thought about. Obviously, I didn't think about the fact that how does this change when you look at this film now. And it really put it in perspective for me. And I highly recommend everyone seeks out this particular piece, Unwrapping the Candyman. It's excellent. And like I said, go check out Hard Noir if you haven't, because there's a really great discussion in there too. So Candyman's just had a huge impact. It's one of those things where, I mean, how many true boogeymen came from modern horror, right? I mean, we already had Dracula and Frankenstein from, literature that had already existed. There's obviously the kind of the three that we just think of as today's boogeymen, right? You get Jason, you got Freddy, you got Michael. Sometimes people put Leatherface in there. Not quite sure. I think he's become more popular as all of those remake sequels came out, but not quite sure if he's still that boogeyman status. Candyman creeps into there, and he really kind of makes it into that kind of zeitgeist in a way that I think everybody knows. You don't say Candyman 5 times, right? And it's just kind of, it surpassed the film in so many ways, and even more so, right? I mean, it surpassed Barker's short story. I think many people haven't read the short story, but they know the story of Candyman. And the story of Candyman they know is from the film. And hopefully it's from the first film. More than the third. I mean, there's a new one coming out soon, so that's another reason why I've been thinking about this one a lot. Curious where they're going to go with it. We shall see. So, since I didn't have any cool Laserdisc to show off this episode, I figured I'd at least show you the cool thing I do have of Candyman. And that's the McFarlane figure. I don't know if most of you remember this, but back in the day, Tom McFarlane did an excellent line of horror toys. Luckily, Candyman was one of them. Beautiful. I'll take some stills. But I did want to reveal under the coat is the chest cavity waiting for its bees. So yeah, I mean, I really highly recommend you check out the Candyman Blu-ray from Scream Factory. I know, I'm like a Scream Factory army over here, but until they start sending me free ones, I'll just keep going through the ones I own already. Check it out. I mean, you guys know I'm a Clive Barker fan, and unfortunately, he's had a lot of film problems over the years, where the first, I mean, Hellraiser started amazing. As a series, it trickles over time, kind of quickly. And, I mean, we've discussed in depth Nightbreed, right? So we know how hard it was for him there. Upcoming, we still got to talk Lord of Illusions. I love that movie. We'll get to that one. But he had a lot of other mishaps in the middle, like Rawhead Rex, which he still is over and doesn't want to talk about anymore, where he licensed and was really unhappy with what happened. So it is really excellent to know that Candyman was that one beautiful time when Clive didn't have to make it happen himself for there to be a wonderful adaptation of one of his stories. I mean, he's not like Lovecraft, that kind of level of impossible to put on the screen. It's just, his style is so different than what I think many people were ready for back in the 80s and 90s when he first came out, and threw people for a loop. They didn't know what to make of it, so they wanted to simplify it quite a bit. And you see that with Rawhead Rex. They turned into a very simple monster movie, which isn't what it is. So, again, it's just, this is probably one of the reasons that I love Candyman so much, is it's just the best telling of one of Barker's stories that Barker didn't make. And that's great that exists. Of course, I mean, Virginia Madsen is amazing in the film as Helen, and Tony Todd is so iconic in this role. I mean, he's one of the, like I said, he's one of those villains that I can't picture anybody else in. He's, perfect for this role in so many ways. And I mean, I've seen him in plenty of other things, particularly Star Trek, Urban Legends, things like that. But this is the film that you just pops into your head when you think Tony Todd. We'll talk about Night 90 eventually as well. So to sum up, yes, I love Candyman. Great film. Beautiful haunting feel. Amazing score. Excellent acting. Tight script with wonderful source material. In-depth backstory given to the character. It's a smart film. It's a beautiful film. And it still works today. And I think it's going to stand the test of time, like many of our modern horror classics. And I hope if you haven't seen it in a while, give it a rewatch. Maybe pick up this Blu-ray. If it's something that you hadn't seen, I really wish you would take the opportunity to check it out, because the original film is so perfect. It's really worth it. And just, if you hadn't seen it in a while, this is a good time to pick it up again, give it another view, really see how timeless it's become. Yeah, check this one out. It's worth the purchase. And that's what I got for you this month from the Horror Academic. Thanks.